Hi everyone, my name's Seth. I'm originally from the UK, but I kind of grew up a little bit all around the world. Uh, I always had a passion for the mountains, but for me it wasn't the easiest path to kind of get experience in that. So I first learned to ski by dragging a pair of X-Higher skis up a peak and then just trying to figure out how to get down. I learned climbing by using old ship ropes that me and a friend found and trying to figure out how to climb rocks with them. But over the years, I've been kind of super lucky to meet lots of really interesting people who are able to kind of share their experience. And I've then been lucky enough to kind of ski and climb all around the world, really. And that's eventually, to some degree, led me to move to Norway, kind of in search of snow. So I'm here to kind of to talk about a trip called Pyrenees 30. Well, that's what I named the trip anyway. And it's the kind of long-winded story between skiing and climbing kind of 3,000-meter peaks of the Pyrenees. So my parents moved to the Pyrenees, I guess, about 15 years ago now, quite a long time ago. And I've always been in love with the Pyrenees since then. It was my kind of first mountain range in many ways. It's where I learned to ski tour, and I got to explore like quite a bit of the Pyrenees. But I always felt this was kind of going back 2 years ago. I felt that there were lots of areas of the Pyrenees that I never managed to explore. I kind of didn't find the reason or the kind of motivation to go and explore those areas. And so I felt like I needed some kind of incentive to do this or some kind of mechanism. So I was, bored and doing research on potential cool trips, and found some documentation about the kind of 30 highest peaks of the Pyrenees, or the 33,000ers, and thought that this sounded like a great opportunity to test myself. Once the kind of idea was born, I managed to drag two friends into it, Will and Cameron, who you'll kind of hear more about on the trip. And we spent about 6 months kind of planning and training up to the March of 2019, where we planned to climb the 30 highest peaks, the 33,000ers, in 30 days. So this was designed as a combination of kind of lots of exploring, but also I was starting to kind of race more in running and skiing, as a kind of way to test ourselves kind of physically and our competence in the mountains. So that's kind of the lead up to the trip. So just to give everyone a bit of reference, obviously the Pyrenees is between France and Spain, French and Spanish border. It's the kind of quieter version of the Alps, but it doesn't make it any less spectacular. So the highest mountains are in the center of the Pyrenees, kind of with love hearts here because I was so fond of them. And these 30 pinpoints are the 30 peaks we wanted to climb in 30 days. Now there's a dozen ways that you can cut what are the highest peaks. Now the challenge that I'd read about was describing the kind of 30 peaks with more than 150 meters prominence. So I kind of double checked this with some other websites, and this seemed to be a good challenge that we were ready to throw ourselves on. It's worth saying at this point that from the very outset, we were aware that climbing 33,000 meter peaks in 30 days was highly ambitious and would require one a day, which really we were going to climb a couple, like two in one day some of the time, and have some bad weather days. But we wanted to set a high goal to kind of motivate us to get ready for it. So from our mind, there were kind of three things that we needed to be ready from this. So one was to get kind of super fit. Another was to build tons of resilience just to endure kind of 30 days of back-to-back long days out. And the third was to get lots of exposure in the mountains, just get used to being in kind of mountain environments again. At this point, I lived in Bristol in the UK, and so did my two friends. And so I spent probably 3-4 weeks in the Alps and the Pyrenees a year. So we want to spend lots of time in high mountain environments. Now, the kind of training is often the easiest part because, the training for a trip like this is just high volume. So we did lots of running, lots of cycling. We did ski sits, anything we thought could kind of charge our legs for this adventure. And I was also lucky enough to spend some time in the Pyrenees in the lead up to it, and so got out on skis quite a bit. Now, when you live in the UK, finding bad weather to improve your resilience is remarkably easy, and living near Wales makes it even easier. So, in order to kind of get ready for this trip, we embraced any bad weather, and whenever we could find some proper Welsh winter weather, we'd go out with skis and we'd ski across either wet snow or grass, whatever we could find. But it actually proved kind of invaluable. That kind of training through really nasty weather proved like really helpful later in the trip. Exposure in the mountains is, sometimes a little bit harder to get in the UK. But again, I was super lucky to live near Wales and to have access to that. So me and Cameron would go to Wales any weekend that winter was vaguely showing up. I'm pretty sure we're some of the very few people to have ever gone up the Welsh winter gullies with skis on our back, whether or not there was snow for the way down. But we enjoyed the training. We had some great trips, and physically we kind of felt super ready, or as ready as we could be. I always find it a lot easier training than planning, because planning kind of takes less fun and takes more time. And as we dug into the details of this trip, we realized like the volume of stuff that we would have to organize was pretty huge if we were going to pull this off. And also, I mean, not compared to some of the more remote regions of the world, but it's quite hard to find information out about in the Pyrenees. There's not so many details as somewhere like the Alps. But, we had 6 months to do it. We spent a lot of time after training and things kind of planning. And eventually we had a plan A, a plan B, a plan C for every peak. We had the logistics of getting between the peaks. And we were pretty much ready to go. So early March 2019, we packed our van to the absolute brim, full of ski kit and enough food for over 30 days. We set off from Bristol and drove down to the Pyrenees. A long drive, helped by some good podcasts about skiing and some loud pumping music. And we arrived in the Pyrenees. So just for reference, the big chap on the right is Will. So he's one of my best friends from Hong Kong. He's a doctor and kind of ski enthusiast. He was really joining the trip to get a bit of skiing in when he could, but also amazingly graciously just to help with the logistics, essentially to cook when we were too dead to cook, and to kind of drive us places when we were too dead to drive ourselves. The smiley chap in the middle, you'll always see him with a big grin on his face. This is Cameron. Me and him have done lots of trips across the world. We've done trips in the Himalayas, and he was going to be the other kind of skier of the trip. So the idea was that me and Cameron would be out beasting ourselves every day. Will would come out for a couple of hours, go back to the van, chill out, and then kind of essentially help us out. So after a 2-day drive, we arrived in the Pyrenees mid-afternoon. We went for a quick trial on our kind of matchstick skis, and then we went to sleep, ready in the knowledge that we're going to wake up the next day for our first out of 30 days of punishment. And bearing in mind that we knew there were kind of so many things that could happen, we were super happy when we woke up. Conditions were perfect. And we went up our first peak called the Tuc de Moulier, so 3,011 meters. It was easy. We were feeling really good. We took it nice and easy, had great views, and it couldn't really have been better. So we got back down to the van early afternoon after a good ski descent, kind of 2,000 vertical meters and quite a long descent as well, 20 something K, I think. We packed ourselves with food and went to sleep in the happy knowledge that we're going to wake up ready and enthused for day 2. So it's kind of probably not an understatement to say that what happened next was pretty bad luck. So I woke up at about 3 a.m. being violently ill, and like really violently ill. My immediate thought was kind of a hope that this is just a bit of a fluke. Maybe I got myself too excited, something like that. But by kind of 6 a.m., Cameron started being ill. and by midday the next day, Will was joining in the party. So we were very lucky that we could bail back to my parents, and it became pretty obvious pretty quickly, especially with the doctor, that this wasn't kind of something small. We'd got a really nasty waterborne infection. Amazing, given that we were being obsessively careful about kind of hygiene and things like that. But these things can happen. So we were ill for quite a long time. So it took us 8 days to be ill and then get semi-recovered. Just for kind of reference of how rough we were feeling, I lost 8 kilos in those 8 days. But by the end of the 8th day, we were feeling like we could get back out in the mountains. We obviously had to reframe the adventure a bit. So we couldn't do the 30 peaks in 30 days anymore. So we had a thought about how we wanted to pitch it. And this was possibly the beginning of a bit of a mistake, because really we should have just appreciated that we were in the mountains, we had some time, and we should have enjoyed it. But we decided to kind of plow on and say, how many peaks can we do in the remaining 22 days? So with that in mind, we got back out there, and lighter than ever, we set up our next peak, which is the Pic des Stats. We were feeling pretty shaky after 8 days, but it was great to be back in the mountains. This was one of the first new peaks for me, so it was really exciting to go explore this end of the Pyrenees. Sorry, I'm just having a look. Yeah, I don't know if everyone can hear me, but please shout out if you can't. Okay, yeah, here we go. So yeah, we first day out of our kind of self-imposed quarantine, we got up the Pic des Stats, and conditions were icy, but we had some fantastic technical skiing down, and we were super glad to be back out in the mountains, to be doing what we wanted to do. So we had a couple of days of success after that, climbing a couple of peaks, all in good weather. And I think the third day after we'd got back into the mountains, we wanted to go back to the scene of the original crime, back to the Aneto region, and to do a route called the Celenquezaret. When we set out to do the 30 peaks, we were going to kind of climb them via any route. You know, the challenge was to do 30 peaks. But after our illness, we decided that we really wanted to do interesting routes up the peaks. We wanted to take, routes that we were inspired by. And one of these had always been the Celenquezaret. So it's quite a famous route in the Pyrenees. It's a rock climbing ridge in the summer that starts very high up. So the start of the ridge is above 3,000 meters. And it's a 12-hour kind of rock climb onto the summit of the highest peak of the Pyrenees. So we'd wanted to do this in winter. We thought it was a super exciting opportunity to kind of use this time to get at the Aneto a different way. When we set out in the morning, we checked the weather forecast, and there was supposed to be a storm in the morning with some snow and some wind, and then clear in the afternoon. So when we set off first thing in the morning, we weren't too worried that it was a bit cloudy. There'd been some snowfall, but not too much. And so we kind of set off. As we climbed higher and higher up into the mountains, the weather didn't clear. We started to kind of question it, but we hoped it wasn't too bad at this point. We hoped that we would be able for the weather to clear and to be able to complete the route the next day. We got to the ridge of the Aneto about 4 p.m. And it was kind of at that point, at the kind of worst possible point, that the weather really broke and suddenly came in really, really nasty. We were super high and exposed at this point, and it became pretty clear pretty quickly that there was no way we were going to be able to do the ridge the next day. It just wouldn't be safe. And it also became clear by how bad the weather was up there that kind of bivouacking up and returning down the next day probably wasn't going to be the safest option either. So we made the tough call at kind of late in the day, as it's almost starting to get dark, to turn around and go back down to the van. It was a good call. Like, one of the first turns I did kind of set off a small slab, nothing dangerous, but just an indication that, it wasn't somewhere we wanted to be hanging around. After a few hours descending with big heavy rucksacks, because we had all our technical gear, we made it back down to the valley. Now, in the Aneto Valley, there's kind of this long, like 4 or 5 kilometer flat valley, and we had to ski back along this during the dark. We're pretty tired. We're super worn out by being ill the week before, and we trudged on down this valley. While we were going, we were chatting about things, and both mentioning that we were pretty frayed. And Cameron was particularly saying that kind of he was struggling to get his head in the game after being ill the week before, and he just wasn't really feeling it. So with our head hung low, we took another chat and another think about what we were doing. And Cameron made the super sensible call for him that his mind wasn't really in it, and if your mind's not in it in the mountains, then you shouldn't, it's not a place to be. And I super respect that and I'm super glad that he made that decision kind of when he did, because it's the right call. So he flew home to kind of recover essentially from our illness, because we were still feeling it. But I was feeling good, and I was feeling kind of still super keen to come here to what we wanted to do. So again, sat down with Will this time and thought, like, what are we doing? How do we do this? And we thought, we've come out here, we've spent the time getting here. Let's come here and do what we wanted to do. So the plan going forward was to continue just skiing all the 3,000 meter peaks I could. Now, obviously, it got a bit complicated because Cameron had been the other skier, and Will was there for lots of other stuff. So what we decided going forward was that Will would start out with me in the morning for a couple of hours, and that he would then return to the van, and I would kind of carry on up and taking the peaks as I deemed safe. Luckily, at this point in the trip, we were blessed with some amazing weather, so we had some fresh snow, but not too much. And we started to get back out there. So every morning we'd wake up nice and early, we'd set off together, and then I would peel off and take in some peaks and catch up with Will back at the van for some food. So because I was largely on my own, I apologize for the many ugly selfies that come this way, but that's kind of the only way to proof of the pudding that we were up there. But from here, the trip started to get into a bit of a rhythm. So we started to tackle these peaks, most of them or some of them from the original 30, but also linking it up with any other peaks that we could. The snow was in pretty good condition. So we had, it wasn't the biggest snow year, as you can see, with lots of rock around, but the snow was stable. And at that time of year, kind of mid-March, tends to get a little bit soft during the middle of the day. So it's some nice descents if you're not up there too late. And we just had fun. So Will came up one peak all the way to the top, and it was great to have a full day with my best buddy up there. We'd done a trip to the Pyrenees when we were about 12 or 13 together, and had lots of misadventures then. So it was great to be back at what we enjoyed doing together. I got to finally do peaks that I had kind of either thought about or talked about for a long time. So the Pic de Maupas is very close to where I live in the Pyrenees, and through weird circumstance, the first time I tried this, I fell over while I was jogging up and split my hand open. And then the next time I broke a ski. So this was third time lucky to finally get up this peak. And it was, nice to be doing that with my friend, to be sharing the experience. Had some super long days, kind of 12 hours, 2,500 to 3,000 meters elevation gain, taking in multiple peaks. And that's really, what we had aspired to do. We'd trained, we'd planned, we'd kind of got our minds ready for it. And so it was just raw fun to be out there for long days. Great weather, super stable conditions. Like, one challenge, if it had been unstable, like doing it solo just wouldn't have been an option. So, counted ourselves really lucky. Every day Will was getting out there skiing, and, he's not done so much skiing, so he was super, super pleased to be getting this exposure to the mountains. So yeah, we just started ticking them off one by one. So most days we were doing a couple, 2 or 3 peaks. They're long, long days, and obviously starting to feel worn down at this point in the trip. This, I think, Peak Cambay and Lentia were about 10 days into our kind of second batch. But you know, this is what we came there to do, and we were really ready to feel like this. So we were just having a grand old time, taking fun at any opportunity. So whenever I'd come across a 3,000 meter peak, I would try and find a scramble, a ski, a climb, whatever it was to get up it. And again, this was just taking me to new areas of the Pyrenees that I'd never seen before. I'd kind of read about all these peaks, spent 6 months kind of studying them. So it was, at this point, it was just really good fun to be living it. Needless to say, the views in the mountains never get old. So I think this is the second or third last day of our trip, this Peak de Posets. And, you know, otherwise we would have been stuck at work. We were just really, really happy to be in the mountains. We'd got in, there's a strange thing in expeditions or trips where you, once you're in the zone, you kind of forget that the rest of life exists, and you ski or whatever it is you do, you sleep, you rest, you eat, and it's a wonderful rhythm of life. And every summit was treated with unbelievable views like this. We had, because we were out there for, in the end, 20 something days, we had all kinds of weather. Generally, we were very lucky with stable weather. But this was a great example of a day where, and this often happens in the Pyrenees, where you set off in the valley and it's all like very heavy weather in the valley. You consider not going up. But if you try and scout out a bit, you suddenly pop above the cloud. And days like this, I had these are some of the most famous mountains in the Pyrenees. And I had them pretty much to myself because the weather had kind of looked bad from further down. So we just saw all sorts while we're out there. We finished on the Pic de Netto, same range where it all started. And this was 22 days into the trip. Finished on a high, good weather, had a great day out. So that was kind of the end of the trip. So we'd had to cut it short. We'd cut our original plan. In the end, I skied 16 3,000 meter peaks, 8 of them from the original group, about 240 kilometers of skiing, and about 21,000 meters elevation gain. So it was we kind of left the Pyrenees with a slightly bittersweet emotions. It had been great fun. We'd done tons of skiing. Obviously, it had been super gutting that Cameron had to go home and hadn't been able to kind of join in, you know, half the fun. And super gutting that we'd also spent 6 months kind of planning for this opportunity, and that we'd had to kind of change the mindset from the start. So over the next year, I spent as much time in the mountains as I could. So doing speed ascents of Mont Blanc, doing technical routes in the Alps, and then going traveling in South America with my partner, where we did lots of climbing as well. The kind of I thought a few times about the Pyrenees 30 trip, and it felt undone. It felt like there was still something to do there, but at the same time, I didn't feel like it was a trip that I wanted to plan from scratch and do all over again. It just felt a bit contrived. So it kind of grated on me a little bit. I never quite got my head around, like, was I happy to leave it there? Did I want to complete it? Did I want to start it again? But trips can do wonders for you, or they can kind of trap you. And I think this was the 3rd or 4th kind of trip or expedition that I'd planned and led. And I kind of got into my head that I wanted to do another. I wanted to do something in the Pyrenees that worked and that was successful. And needing to do a trip is a really bad starting point. And it's easy to see that with hindsight. But at this point, I was kind of super motivated to find something to do, which is definitely not a good starting point. I'd had my eye on a trip for a long time, which was the idea of crossing the Pyrenees on skis, so traversing the Pyrenees. And I think it's a great idea, and it's something I definitely would still want to do. But because I felt like I needed to do a trip, I fitted a square peg into a round hole, and I felt like I had to fit this trip in, even though I wasn't really able to plan it effectively from South America, and in the timescales I had. But I kind of plowed on. So in the lead up, once I returned from South America, I caught up with some friends in the Pyrenees and found out, to kind of make matters a bit more frustrating, it was one of the worst snow years the Pyrenees had had. So there was basically just no snow, which would mean a lot of hiking with skis. And also kind of very low snow late in the year can mean quite a bit of instability as well. So I kind of felt like I had to start the trip. I'd committed time and energy into it, which again, in hindsight, is not a good way to go about it. But nevertheless, I set off. So the plan would be to cycle to the point where I could ski, and then ski across the Pyrenees, and then cycle to the coast once I ran out of snow. So I had a miserable first day. So I cycled 10 hours in kind of brutal winter headwind up to a very high col. And it turned out I was supposed to meet my partner there and swap my bike for skis. But the van that was carrying all the equipment and was going to be my home for that night had got stuck in snow on the other side of the col. So I had to kind of descend all the height I'd lost. And this is a bit of an omen for the trip. But the next day I kind of set off, traveling a little bit like the Tin Man, with all my camping gear. I had a sleeping bag, bivy bag, skis, av bag. But in all fairness, the next 3 days were great fun. So I started just traversing through the east side of the French Pyrenees and into Andorra. And it was just great to be back in the mountains, back in the Pyrenees after a year away. But you know, in many ways, this trip was potentially doomed from the moment I heard about the really bad snow conditions. But things got worse pretty quickly. So the snow pack was really, really bad. There was, because of the lack of snow, logistics were going to be really hard, and it's going to be really, you know, a lot more hiking than skiing. And then just the cherry on the top was that coronavirus made an appearance. And I found out on the fourth day of the trip, on the third day skiing, I found out that Andorra was shutting down the next day. So it kind of took the inevitable choice away from me. So time to go home. So lockdown, as I think for everyone, provided a great opportunity to just have some time and to think. And for me, it was kind of time to think, what on earth was I doing, running around like a headless chicken, trying to organize all these trips, and they were all going wrong. Like, what was I doing? What did I want to do? And after some time and some climbing of my French home, you know, I realized that it was just, I needed to focus more on just doing what I enjoyed doing, and kind of less trying to turn it into something. I knew that I would have some time after lockdown ended where I'd be in France before I'd move to Norway. And I thought, you know, essentially I want to spend time in the mountains. I want to explore. And maybe the best thing to do is to finish the Pyrenees trip, but without the constraints that I previously had. So my ambition once lockdown ended was just to get out, to do all these peaks, to enjoy it, not to worry too much about the timescales, to do it via routes that I wanted to do, and to be in the right mindset for each peak. And it turned out that was the way I should have approached it all along. So the moment lockdown ended, I, like many people, was like a dog let off the leash. So the minute it ended, I was straight in the mountains, and I had my list of peaks, and I'd made a list of interesting ways to get to the top of these, and I was just really, really excited for the opportunity. I had, you know, the original idea was to seek out adventure and explore and to push myself physically, and it didn't kind of take me long to get what I wanted. So the first peak after lockdown was a peak called Peak Bateau, which is on the French side. It's a long ridge from a high col, and there'd been a lot of snow recently. this meant that because of the ridge, it was quite safe from avalanches, but just super physically hard. So many hours of wading through snow, a long time to be in the mountains on your own, particularly in kind of in rough weather. And this is where I wanted to be, knowing that I was safe, but challenging myself, testing myself, and just really being in the environment. The kind of artificial constraint of choosing 30 peaks and sticking to these, presents some good aspects as well as being a bit contrived. There are many peaks in the Pyrenees that I've thought about, heard about, talked about, but just not found the motivation or the reason to go there. And Peak Long is a great example of this. So this is one of the most technical 3,000 meter peaks in the Pyrenees. There's no easy way up it. So it's I think it's a kind of PD or AD scrambling route in the summer. But this was one of the list, and it forced me to find kind of creative ways to find a way up there. And I was so glad I did. It's now, again, it's a route that I've done since in summer. And I know it's so much better. It was a great experience. I got to do routes. Most of the routes from Pyrenees 30 were new, but some of them I'd done before. So my first ever kind of mountaineering route was what's called the North Face of Mont Perdu, which in the summer is kind of an easy AD alpine climbing route. And I'd done it a couple of times. It still remains one of my favorite routes. So it was absolutely great to kind of feel back on home turf, but in new conditions. So to be able to climb and ski this route in winter, when I'd only seen it in summer, was again kind of a really rewarding experience. So this all happened. We were let out of lockdown, I think, the beginning of May, or kind of late April potentially. So in the Pyrenees, this is really the turn between winter conditions high up and summer conditions. So after I had I think skied maybe 15 of the routes, the conditions started to indicate that summer was on its way. But winter never lets go easy. And it's a good lesson just to always relearn that you should always prepare for winter in big mountains. So my last peak on skis was a peak called Pico Taillon, and set off in nice weather, just about enough snow to ski, although everyone has different ideas of what enough snow is, but for me it's very little snow. But I went up with skis nevertheless, and as I kind of got to the summit, it was the last rain, hail, snow of the season, and it was one of the coldest peaks I did. It was one of the last ones I did on skis. It then began the transition from winter to summer. So the entire second part of this trip was over the space of about 6 weeks, but things changed pretty quickly in the Pyrenees. And it was the first time that I'd been in the Pyrenees at this time of year. So I'd often been in the dead of winter. I'd often been in the middle of summer. And it was really unique for me to be able to see this transition, and just, really spectacular to see summer hitting down in the valleys and still the edges of winter higher up. As it became harder and harder to justify carrying skis up for a 12-hour hike, I transitioned to kind of climbing and running the peaks and sliding down the snow on my butt where possible. Again, kind of seeing the transition of the seasons and being part of that transition was something, it's an opportunity you don't often have, and something I really enjoyed. And because I had a better mindset on this trip, because I wasn't only aiming to kind of fulfill a contrived set of aims, I was more in the moment, and I just enjoyed the whole experience more. So it wasn't just the mountains. Between mountains, I was camping up high in the Pyrenees with the cows and not much else for company. And I just enjoyed that time. I relished being in that environment. And I was, again, like I mentioned before, I forgot about all the extra stuff going on in the world. It's just so special to be in that moment. So every day at this point, I was kind of waking up and doing long routes, long link ups. And I was super jaded by this point. I think it had been 20 days with a couple of rest days thrown in, but mainly back to back. But this, after all, was what I'd planned from the beginning. This is what I'd got ready for, and potentially, as opposed to the first trip, I kind of enjoyed the tiredness at this point, because it made it more worthwhile. It made the peaks kind of more of a challenge to get up, and that in turn made each one more rewarding. And half the idea of the trip had been to explore new areas, and I really got to do that and to enjoy exploring them in the second half of the trip. So this is a region called the Odessa, and I'd never been there. Again, I knew it was somewhere that was apparently spectacular and lots to do there, but I'd never found a way there. And now this is one of my favorite areas of the Pyrenees, and this is exactly what I'd hoped to get out of the trip from the start, was an understanding and an experience of new areas of the Pyrenees. So by the end of the trip, it was firmly summer, and I was pretty much just doing scrambling and running, which meant amazing long link ups. So instead of just trying to get to the top of a peak, I could find ridges that linked peaks, able to cover kind of lots more ground, and just seeing even more of the Pyrenees than I'd initially anticipated on the 30 trips. So needless to say, when the last peak was done, I was pretty physically spent. It had been a long kind of 30 plus days, but I was very aware that I'd chosen to do that. There was kind of no need to do it this time, and that I'd experienced not only the 30 peaks and new areas of the Pyrenees, but I'd kind of tested new routes, I'd tested new ways of moving in the mountains, and that in the end, I'd got a lot more from the trip than I actually anticipated. In this kind of second part of the trip, I climbed 32 of the 3,000 meter peaks, including the remaining 22 of the kind of original 30. Managed to put out about 400 kilometers on skis and climbing, and about 35,000 meters of elevation gain. And in doing so, ripped through 3 pairs of shoes, but it was worth every pair. So yeah, to kind of summarize, like the main thing for me, the kind of realization was that, basically I really love being in the mountains, and that, I need to be careful not to forget that when kind of trying to embark on trips. Planning projects is an absolutely great thing. It can motivate you and inspire you more than maybe just going out and trying whatever you fancy that day. But you've also got to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. And for me, that's just to spend as much time as possible in the mountains and just to enjoy being there.
What skis were you using?
So I call them my matchsticks. So in order to just do that distance, as part of the trip, we got hold of a pair of Skimo racing skis. So they're 60 millimeter, 160 centimeter long voile skis, and I was using this for the majority of the trip. So they're super light. They obviously are abysmal to ski at times. And when I did take the liberty. I also have my older skis are a kind of much bigger pair of all mountain skis. So when the conditions were too good to pass up, I took those out for a spin. But yeah, in general, it was a pair of tiny racing skis, just because of the distances and altitudes.
What you may have said, but what was your sort of favorite part of the Pyrenees, or favorite episode?
Like, favorite area or favorite mountain, I guess, because
that might be the same thing. I'm not sure really. You tell us.
Yeah. Okay. So I think my favorite area was the Odessa, which is it's kind of the other side of Perdu, and it was just breathtakingly beautiful. You've kind of got these really big, wide green valleys and these kind of rock monoliths coming out of it with lots of different really impressive rock layers. And then kind of, my favorite trips was quite different. So it's hard to compare kind of apples to apples, but I did, there's particularly one kind of running and climbing loop that was a circuit of, not the Circuit of Gavarnie. I loved it that much I've forgotten the name, but there's kind of a big circuit of peaks all on a ridge. And it was a horrendously long day, and that's when the last photo was taken. I was so beat by the end, but that was just breathtaking. And then in the winter, I kind of did the north face of Perdu on skis, and that was just some of the best skiing I've done.
From Mike, have you skied in the Aguas Tortes? Do any of those peaks make the top 30? They probably don't.
No, I don't think so. It's been something that you can do the top 100 peaks and still not explore it all. It's something I've kind of heard about a few times and been interested in, but it's not something I've ever managed to make my way to, you know.
Yeah, they definitely don't make the top, the over 3,000, but it's just fabulous traveling in that area.
Yeah, and this is kind of like an interesting thing about these trips is whichever way you cut it, you're going to miss something out. And that is a shame, but I guess the flip side of that is it leaves something else to do next time, which is good.
Seth, you may have said, but when were you planning your original 30 peaks in 30 days? What's the sweet spot in terms of timing for optimal snow?
Yeah, so I mean, Kathy, I'm sure will weigh in here because she knows the Pyrenees more than me. The Pyrenees is, from my experience, is super variable. I mean, I know all mountains are, but it's hard to pick a sweet spot. But essentially, kind of middle of March to end of April tends to be like still enough snow and more stable snow. But that seems to depend very much year to year, whether there's enough snow or whether kind of winter seems to often come back in the Pyrenees. So the second trip I did, the first kind of like this was post-COVID. So this was, I think, like end of April, and we were hit by all kinds of winter. And I was more concerned about avalanche risk in end of April. So it depends year to year. But yeah, I would say kind of end of March, April tends to be. Kathy?
Yes, I would agree. The Pyrenees is an amazing place to ski, but it's variable. I think it's getting more variable. And the people who get the really good skiing tend to be the locals who live here. You can see the good break coming, get your skis out, get out there. I think it's really quite hard to pick a date a long time in advance. If you do that, you really do have to be prepared to ski kind of whatever you get. And it's likely to be a bit of a lucky dip.
Has anybody skied that set of 30 peaks in one winter or a similar set?
No, I don't think so. So from the information we could find, but again, these things, it's a bit of a gray area because there may well be some kind of rogue Frenchman with a cigar hanging out who's done it just as a kind of hobby thing. But we couldn't find any evidence that they've all been skied in one season.
Okay, and second question, were you doing all these as day trips, or were some of them from huts or winter rooms? Or?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something I kind of didn't really cover. So the vast majority were day trips. There were 2 or 3 routes that required a bivouac, the more technical routes generally, and I think we used 2 huts, and the kind of the reason for that really was that, like, because of the numbers we wanted to ski, we kind of needed to do 1 in a day. And then also there's this kind of never-ending question of, like, if you carry enough for the night up there, is it easier to set off half an hour early with a good night's sleep and a full belly and do it quicker? And so we kind of mainly opted for doing them all in, like doing 1 a day.
Really like all the pictures you put up. So it must have been fantastic to have actually been there. You mentioned that particularly towards the summer, you were doing more technical climbing. I was curious about some, like the Pic de la Dana, the Don de la Dana. Was that, I mean, that looked pretty edgy on snow. Did you do that as a technical climb, or did you ski it?
Yeah, so, well, as with kind of like quite a lot of the Pyrenees, the very top bits are super technical, and there's kind of no way you're skiing up or down it. So the Dent de l'Ardenne was a great example, and this is a case where 6 months of planning had been good, because I'd kind of read about this, and there's I think it's 65-degree passage up, so I took 2 technical axes up with me kind of for that bit, in the knowledge that that was coming. But it's obviously always it's a horrible, more than once in the Pyrenees, I've got to within kind of 10 meters of a summit and been stymied on the last 10 meters by it being too technical or not having the right gear.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of planned in advance as much as possible. It tends to be easier in the summer. Obviously not everything is doable, but most of the routes have a kind of a like a safely scrambleable way up. In the winter, it tends to be harder to get to some of the summits, some of the more tricky ones.
It's another question, kind of semi-related. How many times, so obviously you were waylaid by illness, particularly at the beginning. How many times were you waylaid by avalanche risk? How many times did you have to turn back or change plans because of avalanche risk?
Yeah, so actually, given all the other bad luck we had, we were amazingly lucky with that. So we obviously, we were kind of changing plans on the fly. So when there were bad avalanche conditions, chose a route that I knew well to be safe in kind of more risky avalanche terrain. And we kind of moved to different areas of the Pyrenees to kind of hide from the weather. So there were 2 routes that I turned around halfway up the route because how the conditions felt, which, given the kind of number of days and how variable the weather can be in the Pyrenees, that was a very lucky streak.
You're now living in Norway. Have you got plans anywhere kind of in the north of Europe to do something similar to this again?
Yeah, so COVID, I think, just has thrown everyone for a couple of years. And I think we come out the end of that just feeling a little bit like stoked to get back out there. And on top of kind of doing a fair bit of skimo racing this winter, I'm currently planning with a friend to try and tackle. There's a kind of a well-known thing in Norway in the summer of like the 50 highest peaks of Norway. And we're just digging into the details of whether that's possible in winter. And so kind of trying to book some time into that.
How spread out are the 50 highest peaks in Norway? I mean, it's a big country.
Yeah, it is. But again, a bit like the Pyrenees, and this is kind of the downside of the trip, is the central, there's an area called Jotunheim, which is like the main area. And the vast majority of them are there. But yeah, obviously, I mean, and driving anywhere in Norway with the road speeds that we have, like there are a few that are a couple hundred kilometers away, which equates to like 7 hours driving. But yeah, I plan to be in Norway for quite a long time, so I figure that I can tackle one area at a time.